Well, I'd like to begin by thanking the ASLS for giving me the opportunity today to speak to you about Derick Thomson. Despite the difficult situation we're currently in, it's still a real pleasure and a privilege to speak to you about poetry, even if I can't do it in person. And I hope this online talk will still be helpful to you in the work you do. I'll do my best to provide you with as much material as possible. Now, all of the poems that I mentioned today and from which I provide quotations are available as a handout for you to read over again at your own leisure. So there's going to be a link, I think, below this talk that you can look at them later as well. If I had to think about of one Scottish Gaelic poet, particularly from the 20th century, who would be most accessible to school pupils, I would honestly pick Derick Thomson every time. His poetry covers a number of interesting themes which could easily be aimed at school pupils and then followed up with further discussion in relation to social, historical, cultural and political discourse. Many of his poems are quite short and succinct, which should also make it convenient to teach in the limited time that you may have in class. I have deliberately picked a number of poems today for close reading, which I feel best represent Thomson's overarching work and which should give you a flavour of what can be used in the classroom. I also think it's a rather nice coincidence for me to be speaking about Thomson to an audience who are so involved with education because, again, I can think of no other 20th century Gaelic poet who was as influential in the field of education as Thomson. Scotland really has much to thank him for in his tireless work in preserving Gaelic and also for ensuring that it has a healthy future. He was not just a poet, but a teacher too, who knew the value of education and the importance of being able to provide teaching materials in his mother tongue. And for a language such as Gaelic, that is actually a huge deal, even now. Thomson was born in Stornoway in 1921 and he was brought up in Upper Babel by his parents, Christina and James Thomson, who were both teachers themselves. And I think this may be why he put so much emphasis on teaching. It was in his blood. He was educated at the Nicholson Institute in Stornoway and he went on to the universities of Aberdeen, Cambridge and Bangor. He lectured in Edinburgh, Glasgow and Aberdeen universities before becoming Professor of Celtic at Glasgow in 1963. And he held that post until his retirement in 1991. If this had been his only life's work, with the addition of his poetry, of course, it would have been impressive enough. One of his former students, Professor Donald Meek, has credited him with modernising the field of Celtic studies. However, Thomson did not stop there. He was also a writer and a lexicographer and a publisher. He set up the Historical Dictionary of Scottish Gaelic with its editor, Kenneth MacDonald. And in 1981, he brought out a new English Gaelic dictionary and he established Girham, the quarterly Gaelic journal and publishing house of the same name. Girham ran for 200 issues over the next 5 decades. As publisher and editor, he produced over 150 works by other authors in Gaelic. And he was also instrumental within the Gaelic Books Council, serving as chairman from 1968 to 1991. Perhaps lesser known is his involvement in politics. He was chairman of the SNP's Gaelic Committee in the 1970s. He died in 2012 at the age of 90, and it's fair to say that his life spanned almost the whole of the 20th century, taking Gaelic into the 21st century with his vision and purpose. I mention his work outside of poetry because it meant that he was based in an urban setting for a large part of his life, mainly in Glasgow. And this separation from his homeland of Lewis, while beneficial to furthering Gaelic culture, language and literature, often meant that he felt homesick and alienated from his island. This feeling of dislocation is explored thoroughly in a number of his poems, sometimes portrayed as the separation from a lover and a loss of innocence which can never be retrieved. But what about his poetry? Well, his poetic career really began in earnest in 1951 with the publication of Angela Briesje, The Broken Picture. He published 9 of his own collections, which included Creachna Clarcy collected poems, 1940 to 80, and went right up to 2007 with Sul Irfara surveying the horizon in 2007. If I were to describe his poetry to school pupils, I would want to highlight a number of themes, both personal to Thomson as an islander and a Gaelic speaker, and more universal in scope as well. In no particular order, they would include separation from homeland, homesickness and longing. In Gaelic, that's known as Cianalas. The Highland clearances come up a lot, and other historical events in Lewis and beyond. So he had a real sense of history. Glasgow and his experiences as a Gael in an urban setting. Now, this is much more common now at the present time, but being an urban Gael and the experience of that through poetry was definitely an underexplored topic in 20th century poetry before Thomson. So he really brings that through in his work. Scottish nationalism is another theme. That theme often comes a bit later in his work. Most importantly, perhaps, is the Gaelic language itself and his feelings about language loss as well. And another theme that is often underexplored, but especially in researching this today, it's come up again and again for me. I'm not going to talk too much about it today, but it's something to bear in mind that might be of interest to some students, is nature and the seasons. It permeates a lot of the poetry, even when it's not a poem that would be specifically centred on nature. It still comes through quite strongly. Thomson's experience as an urban Gael and the sort of hybrid identity that this engendered in him is very interesting in his work. While he spent much of his life in Glasgow, the feeling, and I would use homesickness, but I would also use the word guilt here actually, because that does come through. This guilt and homesickness of leaving behind his island community in Lewis is explored in poems such as Leonard Moige, Sweetheart of My Youth, Mochul Reem, O Hiawn Uye, My Back Turned to My Destination, and Ershrach Anmoch on a Late Street. If you're looking for a poem by Thomson which shows how Lewis has shaped him, despite his separation from it, I would go no further than Katrina Vore, which beautifully describes the continued influence of his island on his life. However, there are also some beautifully written poems about his observations of Glasgow life and the people that he encountered in the city. Strach and in Glasgow, Street in Glasgow, and Glasgow in Glasgow come to mind here. Thomson's understanding of history is also significant, especially in relation to how he views the changing nature of community. Nalochlanig, Achian, Eirchir and Nish, the Norsemen coming ashore at Ness, is a poem that describes how the Vikings became settled farmers as well as raiders and were assimilated into the island. But it could also be interpreted as a poem about how one copes with the move to other places. The last line, Agus Galav and Cianalas, and their homesickness went away, is as relevant in Thomson's life experience as it was for the Norsemen. But I'm going to now do some discussion of some specific poems as a kind of example of how you could maybe use these in the classroom. And I want to start really with the Herring Girls. Many of Derick Thomson's poems explore the injustices suffered by the Gaels, and particularly the Highland clearances, the situation involving the clearances and its aftermath in Gaelic life. And a poem that would be useful to teach, which goes beyond the actual events of the clearances and deals with what happened to the Gaels and how they adapted both socially and economically would be Clan Nian and Scatten the Herring Girls. It would be an excellent choice to give to your pupils. Thomson introduces the image of the girls who had to go to lowland and English towns in search of work, the herring girls of the title, who worked in the fishing industry, and they would follow the boats around the coast to places such as Great Yarmouth. The work was hard, and in 3 stanzas, Thomson really manages to paint a very evocative picture of these girls, while also making a comment about the intricacies of Highland-Lowland relationships. The herring girls may have been in a lowly position, but they were tough and they could give as good as they got. The whole poem is enriched by the smell of the sea, the fish and the salt that was so much a part of their lives. An gara mar haichikin salin, ga roshach vom biol, and sal some pichel iranchunga, their laughter like a sprinkling of salt showered from their lips, brine and pickle on their tongues. There is a camaraderie here and also a mockery of those who perhaps would think that they were better than them. This is apparent in the 2nd stanza with the mention of short-arsed curers, and more visibly in the last stanza, Ach va krijtjeken uala an krie, ga humel fallen is vera kutug en tjunga, slishen a fanage nangal. But there was a sprinkling of pride on their hearts, keeping them sound, and their tongue's gutting knife would tear a strip from the lowlanders' mockery. Notice the continuation of the image of sprinkling over these stanzas, and the way in which Thomson so deftly ties these girls into the work that they do, to such an extent that the tongues and the gutting knives become one and the same. I like to think that the metaphor comes about because the herring girls are so good at their job and they do it so instinctively that it becomes almost a part of them. But Thomson also does more in this poem. He uses the herring girls as a symbol of the whole of Highland Hebridean womanhood, carrying the whole of their people. Snamiaran Crunia, Gorich, Ayona Guilach, no a Hoka Glenav Gosocher, Kummer, Sheshgar, Fallen, Gunvierach, Snasulin Hodovin Rifaith, and the stubby short fingers that could handle fish or lift a child gently, neatly, safely, wholesomely, unerringly, and the eyes that were as deep as a calm. He invests them with power here, and there's something that's done by other mid-20th century Gaelic poets too, including Sorrel MacLean, George Campbell Hay, Ian Crichton Smith, and also onto poets such as Nuas MacNichol a bit later in the century. It might be worth questioning actually why so many male Gaelic poets in the last century are so keen to portray the work of women, and also show such an admiration for it, because this is what Thomson is doing here. After the herring girls' work in the fishing industry is over, a life of childbearing and child rearing probably would lie before them. The last lines of the poem perhaps hold the key to this. Oiche robach jaure, ma vashit and dan gaive, yenig ia dunya. On a wild winter's night, if that were their lot, they would make men. In all the sensuality and physicality of that image, there lies a seed of hope that the Gaels will continue despite the hardship. And perhaps Thomson's also aware, even from his own experience, the important work of passing on the mother tongue of Gaelic and its associated culture to the next generation. And that was so often the job of women in that culture, mothers, grandmothers and aunts. So in this poem, there's so much to highlight: social and economic issues, historical detail, and a more spiritual, if that's the right word, aspect of Gaelic resilience. An excellent poem to teach alongside the herring girls would be An Toper, the Well. Like the herring girls, the symbol at the centre of the poem is a woman. But where the herring girls focuses on youthful womanhood, An Toper employs the symbol of the old woman, again a motif that comes up a great deal in 20th century Gaelic poetry. This poem is an exploration of the importance of language and the feelings of the poet relating to language loss, as well as the importance of community transmission of that language. The well and the old woman are really one and the same throughout the 4 stanzas. Stanza 1 begins, Ha toper big a mean avala, some fear ga alach. Right in the village there's a little well and the grass hides it. If we imagine language as a wellspring, fresh, vibrant and perpetual, it's fitting that this well is described as being right within the heart of the community and its culture. And yet the poet hears from the old woman that Ham frich rahad foraniach, the path is overgrown with bracken, and Ha teach dunya and dew, don tober hashin. Nobody goes to that well now, as the old woman and her people once went when they were young. Nur a vashin og, when we were young. It's tempting to hear echoes of the 19th century Mary Vaughan and Oren's poem in this line, itself a poem of nostalgia and a lament for a lost way of life after the clearances. Thomson seems to be saying that if a well is not tended and used, it becomes overgrown and lost from sight, very much like the Gaelic language if it's not used by the community. The old woman in the 3rd stanza asks the poet to go to the well and bring her back some water so that it will revive her and bring colour to her cheeks. The well water, which could perhaps have been a healing well or a sacred well, and the Gaelic language really fulfil the same function. They both give life to the community. The last stanza is quite ominous in tone. The poet wonders if the well was only a dream because he can no longer find it. The old woman too appears to have died. Sa sulien na calich dúnche, sa li chian in luchgar, and the old woman's eyes are closed and a film has come over their merriment. If the language is allowed to die with the older generation, Gaelic will not survive into the future. And this poem featured in Thomson's first collection in 1951, at a time when the survival of Gaelic was a real concern. It still is, of course. A poem like this could spark discussion, perhaps, in students regarding language issues more broadly, as well as the connection between language and culture, minority languages, and the dangers of their extinction across the world. Despite the fact that Thomson was a 20th century poet, certain injustices and historical events weighed heavily on his mind, and none more than the Highland clearances, as I've already mentioned. I think that it is quite telling that Thomson's poetry dealing with the clearances often appear to have been written about something that happened last week or last month, rather than a century or so before. The language is so immediate. And this says a great deal about how fresh it is in the minds of poets such as Thomson. And again, he was not alone here. We see this with Ian Crichton-Smith, Sorley MacLean and Anuis MacNichol too. Perhaps the reason for this is that the effects of the clearances could still be felt by Thomson growing up on Lewis. And these effects were both physical and emotional. The landscape in the Highlands and Islands show the scars of the clearances in the form of ruined townships, still very much visible. And while the events would not have been remembered in living memory by the time Thomson was a young man, songs and stories ensured that the experiences would not be forgotten. And of course, so many people had family members in countries such as America, Australia and Canada, the product of emigration, which came about due to economic hardship that was rooted in the 19th century. Now, one name that comes up quite frequently in poets' work as a symbol of the evil of the clearances, really, is Patrick Sellar, the factor of the Sutherland estate. And the Sutherland clearances were particularly harsh. In 1814, Sellar had the job of clearing some of the residents of Strathnaver. This is the event that Thomson's poem of the same name focuses on, with its evocative imagery. Avliana hu shin and taili bleitigen schnachta. That year we thatched the house with snowflakes. One house, which was set on fire in order to stop tenants returning once the eviction had taken place, was said to have contained an old bedridden woman. Seller is said to have ordered her to be immediately carried out of the house when he realised she was still there, but she died 6 days later. He was brought to trial, charged with culpable homicide and arson, but was acquitted. For the 20th century Gaelic poets such as Thomson, the landowners and factors were not the only guilty parties. We can witness through poems such as this one a sense of the betrayal and anger directed at the church too. A luch iad a chaliach don sichig a shelton hoyolach vayad iren. They hauled the old woman out onto the dung heap to demonstrate how knowledgeable they were in scripture. Many ministers were reliant on landowners for their land and employment and were wary of speaking out against the establishment, although it is worth mentioning that there were some rebel ministers who did speak out. Some of the ministers during the clearances even encouraged their parishioners to leave with empty promises of a better way of life awaiting them elsewhere. And for Thomson, this betrayal of the people adds to the sometimes rather hostile feeling he held for the church. The old woman in the poem has been treated so badly, and yet she and others like her are described as having the peace of God shining from her eyes. Thomson pits this against those who would describe themselves as godly and yet do the opposite. While poems such as Strathnaver deal specifically with Thomson's attitude to the clearances, there is a link between his clearance poems, particularly ones which connect the injustices suffered by the people and religion, and a poem such as An Bodach Rockish, The Scarecrow. Although not a clearance poem, I wouldn't describe it as specifically as a clearance poem, this poem is nevertheless an exploration of the loss experienced by the Gaels, but in a much more subtle way. The religious fever, really, of the evangelical movement, which came to the Highlands and Islands and can be seen in the cultural life of the Gael in the 19th century and beyond, may not have taken the homes from the Gael, but Thomson, as a 20th century poet looking back at the effects of that religion, clearly believes the loss of the rich culture can be just as devastating. While the influence of the Free Church on the Isle of Lewis and its effect on Gaelic language and culture probably requires a more nuanced approach, if it was being viewed through a historical lens, the issue can be handled much more provocatively when coming from a poetic standpoint. An Bodach Rockish, The Scarecrow, looks at the effect of religion, specifically Calvinism, on the Ceilidh House, an excellent symbol for Gaelic language, community and culture. The Ceilidh House is where it all happens, where people tell stories, sing songs and share knowledge, and for this reason is the entry point for the scarecrow of the poem. The coming of Calvinism, symbolised by Fair Cool Ar Du, is Udach Du a tall, thin, black-haired man wearing black clothes, has a visible and powerful effect on the gathered company. Playing cards fall from people's hands. Any form of gambling would be frowned on by a self-respecting Calvinist after all. Va ferishit ag inshe sciolach conal gulben is read na fachlin iravillian. One man who was telling a folk tale about Conal Gulben, and the words froze on his lips. A woman singing songs had the goodness taken out of the music. The fact that the strict Presbyterian faith, which was so quickly adopted by those of the islands, frowned on this sort of secular culture and secular music, meant that much of the richness of that culture was lost in these places. Now, this could be a badge of honour, as witnessed by the folklore collectors such as Alexander Carmichael in the late 19th century and early 20th century. The people he spoke to proudly told him that they had none of that sort of thing around here. But likewise, a cause for sadness among those who honoured that secular tradition. While Thomson would not have been born when this evangelical movement first swept his island, he writes the poem again as if he were present when the scarecrow first came. And this is perhaps telling about how personal the loss of his community's culture feels for him. The first person stance in the poem lends it much more power and immediacy. Of course, it's not lost on Thomson that this adoption of strict religion was also self-imposed by his own people. Thus, to view the community in the Cayley House as passive victims of an outside source can be problematic. Thomson deals with this quandary by using the conventions of the Cayley House itself. The idea that there's this reciprocal relationship between locals and visitors perhaps coming to someone's house in order to explain how the loss of culture could happen so easily. Hug I oren nua guin, he gave us a new song, is Skjolachtin na Hardenair, taken from the Middle East. Is Bruljoch Jegielsnach Geneva, and fragments of the philosophy of Geneva. The sharing of culture which happens in the Cayley House, the idea that each person contributes something, is a fitting metaphor for the way that Calvinism seeped into the consciousness of Gaelic communities and was so quickly assimilated. This was not a one-off act of violence like the clearance of a township by a factor. Rather, it was a slow disintegration of a way of life that was replaced by a new set of beliefs. And it happened from the inside. The last two lines of the poem are particularly effective. Is scoop in chenia and muhanen lar, skuren tourlach loiskirch na broilichen, and he swept the fire from the centre of the floor and set a searing bonfire in our breasts. I probably should mention here as well that despite the fact that Thomson feels so strongly about the way that culture has changed because of religion, actually some of the best ways of viewing Gaelic culture and language, and particularly in the Western Isles, would be to go to a Gaelic service at the Free Church, where you would hear the psalms being sung. So it really is a case of one aspect of culture being replaced by another aspect. But obviously in a poem, he gets away with being a bit more scathing than perhaps we would be if we were looking at the bigger picture. The communal Cayley House fire was replaced by the fire of religious conviction. And this short poem may raise some interesting points of debate for pupils, for students, including the intersection of the relationship between culture and religion, how that works, how they live side by side. When I've taught this poem to first-year students at university, I'm always amazed at how this poem never fails to begin a debate about the wider implications of Indigenous culture and colonial influence, for example, something which I suppose can be applied to many settings across the world and not just within a Gaelic sphere. So to conclude, I hope that I've provided some overview of Thomson's work in the few examples that I've focused on today. His poetry is very accessible, and I encourage you to look beyond these poems too. Many of his themes, such as Gaelic history, identity, and the importance of culture, can also be identified in his other poems as well. But I hope that this talk today has at least given you a flavour of the richness of Derick Thomson's poetry and his importance to Gaelic and Scottish literature in the 20th century. Thank you very much.